Friends, we welcome you to this second class in our two-part series sponsored by the Congregational Care Committee. I want to thank Sylvia Lyons and Rosemary Verrill, Stephanie Boaz. They joined with me as the planning task force for these classes. A couple of you have mentioned last week, either because you were here or because you weren't here and it has piqued your interest. Last Sunday's class, Blessed Are Those Who Mourn, Practicing Christian Faith in a Death-Denying Culture. Last week's class is available on the website. Not only the class recording, but also Bruce's slides. You'll also see in the bulletin today a QR code which gets you to both. So if you missed it or you were here and want to go deeper, you can access it in those ways. Today, we engage the topic, spiritual engagement with life and death belonging to God. And we will do so from three perspectives. First, we will look at ways to understand end-of-life discussions from both a medical and faith perspective. And we will be led by our own member, Dr. Tiffany Hines. Tiffany serves at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where she practices internal medicine and pediatrics, as well as palliative care medicine. In addition, she mentors and teaches residents and supervises nurse practitioners. Tiffany, we're so glad that you are here and will share out of your wealth of wisdom and experience with us. Our second perspective we will look at today will focus on ways to be faithful in reflecting on our lives through telling our stories. And we will be led by Mary Lou Redding. Mary Lou has had a decades-long and very impactful career at the Upper Room. Mary Lou has written 10 books in the last 25 years, the latest of which is this one, which led us to her today. God Was With Me All Along. Let me get the subtitle right, A Guide for Capturing Your Memories and Telling Your Story. Mary Lou, thank you for coming among us to share out of your decades of engagement spiritually with how we live life out of our faith in deep and rich ways. And lastly, we will focus on faithfully grieving, celebrating life, and witnessing to the resurrection. We'll have these three panel presentations followed by a time for questions and discussion. Make sure that wherever you're sitting, you do have the handouts because they are important for today. And if you have time after the class, we hope you'll take some time to browse these extensive resource tables provided by our Congregational Care Committee. Before I turn it over to Tiffany, let us pause for a moment of prayer. The Lord be with you. O God of all our lives and all our circling years, we trust in you. And we know that in life and in death, we belong to you, and that is more than just a faith statement. It is the sacred reality of our lives. So help us to turn to you, God, to engage this truth with open and receptive hearts. Lead us deeper into our belovedness in you, in our lives as we live them, and in our lives to come with all the saints. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Tiffany.
Yeah. How's that? Can y'all hear me now? Y'all hear me now? That's better. Yeah. I'm definitely a little bit taller than Heidi. There we go. Good morning. Thanks for having me here this morning, y'all. And like I said, we have a few different speakers, so I don't want to take too much time. But as the medical professional who works in this realm a little bit, I'm glad to share with you a little bit from my point of view. So I'm just going to talk briefly about palliative care and hospice a little bit, just because those are common scenarios that people I think don't always understand fully. Like you might have experienced it or know something about it. So I just wanted to go over that just briefly. And then I'm going to answer some questions, or try to answer some questions, discuss some questions that were posed by the committee. So does anybody have had experience with palliative care, or kind of know what I'm talking about when I say palliative care? Because I think that word is used a lot. But so it can mean several different things. It actually is a medical specialty. So doctors do extra training to be board certified in palliative care, like an extra fellowship. And also nurses and nurse practitioners and other providers can have that special certification. But it's also just that philosophy of care that is, so even if you're not seeing a specialist in there, but you're talking about palliative care, it just means palliating or relieving, basically. But it sort of goes along with the acknowledgement that something is not necessarily curative, but you want to feel better. So palliative care services can be that whole provision of care by a doctor or nurse practitioner in the office, in an outpatient setting, or in the hospital. Also, sometimes hospitals will have a separate part of the hospital that's considered the palliative care unit, where a patient might transfer from other parts of the hospital to there for care. And then there's also home visits that you can have. So part of palliative care can be that provision of services in a place or a setting. And then palliative care is kind of the bigger umbrella, because sometimes when people are seeing the palliative care doctor, they ask, does this mean I'm going to hospice? And the answer is no. Palliative care is a big umbrella. Hospice is under that umbrella. It's a separate chunk of that. So just because you're getting palliative care, you can have many, many years left for your life expectancy, but you're just focusing on those things. And then hospice care is under that umbrella. And so hospice is also a philosophy of care. I feel like most people have probably had some experience with that, but it's also a payment system. It's a Medicare benefit, so it's also how your care gets paid for. It can be a location of care. So most hospice care is delivered at home, but there are hospice places where people can transfer to live there or stay there for the rest of their care. And there's Medicare rules around all that. And that's important to recognize, again, that this is a Medicare benefit, because all the rules around hospice are determined by what Medicare says you can do and can't do. And then the hospice care delivery is by a whole team. So it's interdisciplinary by requirement and definition and everything. So the whole package is, there's a nurse, a doctor, a chaplain, a social worker. There's maybe an aide. If it's a nonprofit hospice, there'll be volunteers. And then it also includes grief counseling. So if your loved one is in hospice care, you get included in that 13 months of grief counseling. And so for some people, that might be a reason we really encourage hospice, because that they would need that grief counseling and maybe not otherwise be able to pay for it or access it. So, and then for hospice, you also have to be eligible for hospice. So in order to be eligible for hospice, we talk about the surprise question. And that question is, would you be surprised if this person passed away in the next 6 months? And if the answer is yes, they're eligible for hospice. So that doesn't mean, I think probably y'all know this, but just to reiterate, it doesn't mean you are going to die in 6 months. You can be on hospice much longer than that, as long as you're still eligible. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't seek hospice care until you're very near the end of life. And so we a lot of us may have experience with people being on hospice for days or a week or two, but you're eligible for, it's not really unlimited, but it's continually reevaluated. But as long as you are not surprised you would die in the next 6 months. What hospice also, like I said, is the Medicare benefit. So that's what dictates a lot of the care. And so for some people, that is a limiting factor, because if you say you have a limited life, a short life expectancy, but you still want to continue some treatment that's really expensive and hospice won't pay for it, that is a reason why some people choose not to do hospice yet. But anyway, that's, there are a lot of variables in that. But to go into hospice care, you need to both be medically eligible with a surprise question, and you also have to embrace the hospice philosophy. So sometimes people are it's recommended they go to hospice, but they don't embrace or willing to transfer to more of that comfort level of care. So it's not really appropriate for them to go to hospice if they're still wanting to come back to the hospital. Yeah. So does that make sense? Yeah. It's also not 24/7 care. Most people get hospice care at home. And so you have nurses and the staff who come into your home for their visits, but they don't stay 24/7. It's also not just for the last few days, which I think is unfortunate. You don't really get the benefit of all the social work and the chaplain and just the preparation if you're in hospice such a short time. And I'm going to we'll go address some questions that the committee has posed. How may a family begin the conversation regarding patient wishes? And then how do you approach end-of-life planning from a medical perspective while affirming science and as a person of faith? And then how can we address through faith quality versus quantity of life? So for how to begin the conversation, the first advice is that it's never too early. And so it really, I think, is helpful to consider these things around end of life when it's a low stakes opportunity. So if you have a friend or someone who maybe you're not super close to, but they're going through a situation, that's a time to discuss with your partner or your loved one, wow, that's something I can't see myself doing, or I don't think that would be what I would want, or I like the way their care unfolded. I would like for something like that to happen to me. So just having the conversation when it's not about you is a good way to get started. And I also just want to let families know that and let people know when you tell your loved ones what you want for your care, it's a real gift. It's such a gift to people, and people don't want to talk about it. They don't want to, acknowledge that they're approaching the end of life, but it takes a lot of burden off of off your family, because they know that they're providing the kind of care that you want or in the way that you want it. I know my mom just passed away a year ago, and she died suddenly, so it was not expected at all. Well, really, other than she was a little bit older, but it was so easy for our family to go through those next days and planning her services and things, because she'd always told us all these things that how she wanted, and we knew how she wanted to live and how she wanted her transition to be. And so that was easy for us. It was a real gift that she'd given us. The most important thing so the end of life conversations will usually evolve over time, but the most important thing is who is the person who's going to be your decision maker, because that's who you should be having the conversations with, but also that's what the medical team wants to know. We're always going to ask that. Who is the person that will help you who will make those decisions for you when you cannot make them for yourself? Because it's preferred to not be a committee discussion. It usually should be one person who's the spokesperson. And this is just a copy of the Tennessee Advanced Care Directive. We have a lot of examples of this and some documents to help you fill it out, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. at all now, but it's really just number one, identifying the surrogate decision maker and then the alternate surrogate. So if you and your partner were in an accident together, you both were not available to, talk to the doctors, then who is the next person? And then it gives you these scenarios that are hypothetical. They're common scenarios at the end of life, but it's just things to talk through. And that leads to this next question of how do you approach end of life planning from a medical perspective, affirming science and as a person of faith. And that leads to the job of prognostication. So that is, a lot of times people will say, well, how much time do you have, or that type of thing. And that's, we have some science behind that. There's literature that says if you have this condition, life expectancy based on studies or experience or whatever is this. But really, each individual person is going to, live as long as they live. And so that is where I think the faith comes in a lot. A lot of people, say, God's going to take me when God is ready, or sort of things like that. And so they don't want to hear that the doctors and medical team think that your life expectancy may be weeks or maybe less than 6 months. They don't want to hear that. But it's really the responsibility, I think, of the medical team to share that information with you, because otherwise you don't have this opportunity to plan. And so some patients do get upset when this conversation occurs or when they hear this news. But I think as doctors, we shouldn't back away from that, because that is really it is our responsibility, even though it's hard to hear. It's also hard sometimes when you've accepted the fact that your loved one, like you've been told they have, say, 2 weeks left to live, and you're taking care of them, you're loving on them, you've done all the things. 2 weeks come and go, and they're still, looking pretty sturdy. And so patients get upset about that too, when we sort of, because, really your mind is wrapped around this is how it's going to happen. Or also, I have the mental reserve, I have the time off work, I have the finances or whatever to be with them for 2 weeks. And then we're looking at 6 weeks or 8 weeks. We do realize that's hard. And so it is both, science and faith, I think, that have to sustain you when you're trying to accept that information for your loved one, and when I'm trying to give it as a medical professional. I also think, and we're going to get to that too with some of these other things we're going to discuss today, but really, I personally think that even though someone's body is changing physically, their spirit, their soul, their beliefs, all that will also help sustain somebody sometimes if there is some like unresolved issue, or people are fearful about dying even though they're not awake and able to communicate that. There's a lot of resistance to letting go if this is sort of the psychological, spiritual sort of challenges with prognosticating. As far as the type of medical care people get at the end of life, one of the questions was, how does hospice on one extreme differ from ICU care on the other extreme? And I think some of that seems obvious because you're getting like high technology interventions in the ICU. So things like ventilators, dialysis, transfusions, lots of things like that happen in the ICU. But even if you stay physically in the ICU doctors are also, they're ICU doctors. They're not palliative care doctors, but they do a lot of palliative care in the ICU. So they know usually too when it's time to have these discussions and make some of these sort of de-escalation of like cutting back on things. So even if you're physically in the ICU, sometimes that's where people stay for their end-of-life care, obviously, because there's not an opportunity to transfer anywhere else to a different setting. But when you're in a palliative care unit at the end of life or in a hospice unit, really you're still going to get, you're still going to get all the great care. You're still going to get quality of care. You're not stopping care. You're just transitioning the goals of the care to really intense comfort care instead of intense high acuity, you know, other care. So it's not stopping, it's just changing. Sometimes when you're also, we've all been in the ICUs with people or been there ourselves. It's loud. You're hooked up to a lot of things. It's lots of interruptions. And so we also do those transitions to just less interruptions and quieter environment, et cetera. But there's a spectrum of interventions that happen in between ICU and hospice care. So if you are with somebody in the hospital or yourself in the hospital and you find you're sort of approaching where less curative interventions are helpful, you can just sort of also sometimes gradually de-escalate these things to say, okay, let's stop doing as many blood draws, or let's take me off these leads and unhook me from the machines and just check my pulse by touching my wrist and not keep me hooked on the monitor, things like that. So, another question, I'm going to pay attention to my time here. So how does one avoid a bad death, prolonged suffering, and loss of one's identity? And I think my response to that is, what is a bad death, and it's a bad death for whom? Is it a bad death for the person who's dying, or is it a bad death for the family who's, living on with this? Because oftentimes as people approach the end of life, they're not awake, alert, or responsive. And we still can acknowledge their pain or their shortness of breath or their suffering, and we still treat that. But I think oftentimes the bad death is what the family members experience when have seen something occur in the way they didn't like, or that type of thing. So the more time you have to acknowledge the end of life and you can talk about these things, the more ideal your situation. It's not nobody wants to have this happen, but we do know it happens. So the more time you have to talk about it and plan it, the more likely it's going to be in a way that is most acceptable to you. I mean, bad death can be something like a lot of uncontrolled pain or a lot of nausea or confusion. And there are obviously medical interventions to help all those symptoms. We don't always get everybody's symptoms 100% controlled, but there's definitely lots of different things that can help. Yeah. It's a lot of times, again, this psychological or existential sort of suffering that there is no medicine for. And that's when we rely on our chaplains and our social workers, and just to have, and some of the other speakers today may speak on this, but I think generally we think that before someone dies, if they can forgive and be forgiven, if they can, be loved and tell people that they love them, those types of things are not medicines, but they're the cure for a lot of this suffering that we see at end of life, in my experience. And then to maintain one's identity, that's I think part of the next question a little bit too. Some of the emotions and family dynamics of letting go. Part of that is the anticipatory grief of that. That's also why the longer time you have to acknowledge it, the more you have time to sort of anticipate. Both the person who's dying can anticipate the things they're not going to get to do or get to see, weddings, grandbabies, things like that. Or also the family member, just you're anticipating the loss of your spouse or whatever. So that is part of it. But people who are approaching the end of life, they also just naturally withdraw. Usually they want to have a smaller circle of people that they interact with. So as you start seeing that natural withdrawal, it just becomes more, you're not having to decide how to let go. It just happens. People just tend to become more to themselves. And we also just say, people, as far as maintaining your identity, I think people die like they live. So people who are loud and energetic and, you know, complain a lot, they do all that when they're dying. And people who are kind and gentle and thankful, they're like that when they're dying usually too. And so you just kind of want to still acknowledge people's, personalities all the way. Um, and then doing some legacy stuff and that type of thing that we'll talk about too helps with their, honoring their personality and their identity and all that kind of stuff. Um, I think it's time to pass the baton. So we'll have some more questions available at the end if you want. Okay.
Good morning. Oh, yeah. I'm vertically challenged. Um, Thank you for having me here this morning. It's good to be with you. It's always good to be with God's people, in my opinion. Sorry, this is not but cooperating. Um, huh, there we go. Okay. Um, before before I talk about what I want to talk about, I have a handout there, and I want you all to take a minute, literally a minute. I want you to look at the handout. The question on it says, "Who's been the biggest influence on your spiritual life?" I want you to take a minute to think about that, and then I want you to talk to another person about your answer to that question. You have take a moment to answer the question, and then I'll tell you to talk. So you'll have 30 seconds to talk to the other person. Mm. All right, if the second person hasn't talked, switch over. Think they'll be able to hear me? Okay. Okay. Did any of you have any realizations during that short conversations? Have any feelings? For instance, are you feeling gratitude for what you just talked about? Um, at the top of the handout, there are two things that I want you to pay attention to. The first is that the quote, reflection moves us from experience to meaning. In business, they talk about a thing called a big, hairy, audacious goal, and it's a BHAG. Well, this sentence for you is the big, hairy, audacious idea. Reflection is what moves us from experience to meaning. All of us have experiences, forgive me for sharing your personal experience. It's the only one I've ever had. um, so um, we all have things that happen in our lives. Have you ever talked with someone who just tells the story over and over and over again? They don't go anywhere. They don't make any comment, and they don't seem to learn because they stay just at the level of experience. And our culture does not encourage reflection. It simply does not. Our world is too noisy in every possible way. And so reflection is something that doesn't happen automatically. It's something that you have to decide to do. And one of the ways that that happens is through our writing. Several Christmases ago, we have one of the nanas in our family, the grandmothers, is an only child, and she grew up in Wales. And we were having a Christmas gathering, and I was sitting there looking at her and she has two sons and the boys, and thinking, when she dies, her story is going to die with her. And she's had such an interesting life. She's gone so many places, and she's had a wonderful life. But her boys are not talkers exactly. And they don't know a great deal about their mother because they haven't really asked her very many questions. Um, and so I started looking for a book to give her to write down the story of her life. And I found one after a good bit of looking, but it had nothing in it about a faith perspective on looking back on your life. And I'm the kind of person who does everything I do from a faith perspective. And to leave that out in telling my story is leaving out a large part of who I am. There's a quoted verse at the top of the page. The Lord, remember all the long way that the Lord our God has led you. Well, at this stage in my life, if I'm going to remember, I have to write it down because I won't remember if I don't make a record of it. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. And after he wrestles with the angel, he picks up a rock and he names the place where he's standing Ebenezer. And the word Ebenezer means God has brought me to this place. And then he sets up a memorial stone, the same one, by the way, that he used as a pillow the night before. But and he sets up this makes a memorial stone to help him remember what God has done. And that's sort of what we can do when we write about our lives. Sorry. But as I looked for that book, and if you're a writer and you look for a particular kind of book and you can't find it, the obvious answer is, well, then you need to write it. And so that's how this book came to be. God was with me all along because I wanted to help people tell their stories. I want people to, I've taught writing, on the college level, and I taught writers' workshops around the world, helping people to write from their personal experience. But one thing I have learned in all of those settings is that most people are terrified of a blank piece of paper. They just cannot begin. And so that's why my book is built around questions, because you don't have to worry about the blank piece of paper. You could just answer the questions. And in doing so, you will, first of all, give a great gift to your family. And secondly, you'll make discoveries. Writing is always a process of self-discovery. For me, every time I write, I discover something about myself, and usually too about what I'm writing about. But writing is a solitary task. And many people can't do it because, well, 75% of us are extroverts, and extroverts process outwardly. My daughter's one of those. She calls me and says, "Mom, can we talk about so and so?" And so she starts talking, and then I may say, "Uh-huh," or "Uh-huh, what, yeah, and what else do you want?" At the end of the conversation, which, by the way, she has done all the talking, I've just had an occasional word, she'll say, "Thank you so much, Mom, for talking to me." And it's because that's how she processes it. When she has a decision to make, she processes it that way. And most of us, being extroverts, do process things outwardly. And so how do you get yourself to write if it's a solitary goal and you're not a solitary person? The book, God was with me all along, has a section for using it in a group. Some people at Belmont used this book at one Sunday per month. I think it was the first Sunday. They used one of the chapters of this book, and they did the exercises, kind of like priming the pump, interacting with other people, and then writing. Because when you have somebody doing it with you, it's much easier to do the writing. And what they would do is do a small exercise, and then they would give themselves until the next month to finish that section of the book. I have been keeping a spiritual journal for 50 years. And I didn't, that's a long time. And one of the things that I have learned about writing about my life is that if I write about it, first of all, I can choke somebody and they don't die. And secondly, I don't go to prison. So it's very helpful for me to be able to work things through in writing so that I can know myself better and help other people. When I don't keep a journal, and there have been times, when I've stopped for some length of time, I always feel like my life is slipping through my fingers. I say that journaling is looking at your life or listening to your life. Your life has a great deal to teach you. All of our lives have things to teach us and other people, but it won't happen if you don't do the reflection on what your experience have been. So reflecting on your experience is the process of growth in itself. But as I said, we don't get much reinforcement from our culture for doing the reflection. So there's a group format in the book so that people can support one another in doing the work of telling their story. And when in all of the times I've been teaching, people come up to me and say, "I really want to tell my story. I want to write it down for my kids or my grandkids or my brother or sister, but I don't know where to start." Well, this book is the place to start. But the questions, the exercises that you answer in every section, at the end of the section, there's also a blank page to pick up all the stuff that you didn't talk about in the preceding sections. dealing with your memories and writing about your life is sort of like the magician pulling the scarf out of a sleeve. You pull out a little bit, and then that stirs another memory, and you pull out a little bit more, and that stirs another memory, and you pull out a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more, so that it's sort of like you have a muscle that you have to exercise to get yourself to go to follow your memories back. Uh, and I want to emphasize what Tiffany said. 3 years ago, my significant other of more than 30 years died. And when his daughters and I were planning a service, I discovered that I knew way more about their father than they did. They didn't know things. And Casey, that was his name, Casey and I had talked about our wishes always. Casey was in a bit of denial that he was ever going to actually die. But we talked about what his favorite passages of scripture were and what kind of service he'd like to have when he died. And I was doing all this, priming the pump, because I knew that he was still going to deny that he was dying when he was dying. And so I had to get him to talk while he was still here to talk. And when I realized how much his girls don't know about their father, I was sad for them. By the way, I'm thinking of filling out one of these books as if I were him to give to his daughters, because I know way more about their father than they do. And when this book came out, I asked my daughter if she wants a copy. My daughter has never read one of the books I've written. She's not particularly interested. And I asked her if she wanted a copy of this book, and she said, yes, but I want it filled out. I want you to answer all the questions. And that's the only time she's ever wanted a copy of any of the books I've written. So I did it for her, and I gave it to her as a Christmas gift. So she has, well, I didn't tell her everything. She told me once when she was a teenager that when she felt I was ready for it, she would tell me all the things she did. Apparently, I'm still not ready for it, because she has not yet told me all the things she did. My daughter was a challenging person from the day she was born. I won't go into it, but she was a challenge. All those cliches that you hear about redheads, she's all of them. But now I have had a chance to reveal to her some things that she's not particularly interested in hearing right now. In my experience, our grandchildren are a lot more willing to let me talk about when I was a little girl, with the grandma, tell me what it was like before there were cars, those kinds of questions. There are so many, but they are willing to listen because they know that they don't know. And they want to know about the people they love. Our children, on the other hand, many of them are still in the place where they believe they know more than we do. And so why would they need to hear these stories from us? It's just old stuff that happened to you. And, it's not about me, therefore it's not important. If you take the time to listen to yourself, you will make discoveries about yourself. You will do yourself a favor, and you will also give your family a great gift. As Tiffany also said, helping your family to know what you want at the end of your life, and the last section of the book is called On Death and Dying, is to write down what you want your family to do. There's a place to reflect on what kind of service you want, where you want your service to be, who gets your ashes, all those kinds of things. You have to talk about them in order to know what your loved one wants. And as I said, Casey was solidly in denial that he was ever going to die. So I made it a point to ask him those questions, but I would slip it in the middle of another conversation, just out of nowhere. Like if we were driving and I see um, a cemetery, I'd say, where do you want to be after you're dead? Do you want to be in a cemetery? Do you want to be in a grave? Do you want to be cremated? All those things. And I knew all of them because we've talked about them. I have my best friend from here in Nashville. Um, we've been friends since right after I moved here. She is, she has one daughter, and I've tried to engage this friend to get her to talk about the end of life things that she needs to talk with her daughter about. I love her daughter as if she were my own, and I know how difficult it is when you're trying to figure out how to represent a person's life. But she won't do it. My friend won't do it. I've been working for over 4 years now. Every time I'm with her, somehow this subject happens to come up. And I ask her, have you done this yet? Have you written these things down? And she always goes, well, it's just so sad. I just don't want to be sad. And I said, well, you don't have to be sad, but you want to help Ashley. You want her to know. And the only way she's going to know is if you tell her. When you write about your life, and you will discover things. In all the journaling that I've done over the years, I have discovered a great deal about myself. Um, and I have just, one of the things that I have seen is the patterns in my life, things that I do in my life that usually, unfortunately, are not the best path. But I see that I do it over and over and over again. And when it's written down, you can't deny that you've done it over and over and over again. When I heard a statement by a doctor, Wesley Chu, some years ago that said, unsolicited advice is always received as criticism. And when I read that, I thought about my friend that I just mentioned. She came into my house one day and she said, you know, that sofa would really look better over there under that window. And she's a great decorator. I mean, she really has a gift for it. But what I heard when she said that was, the place where you have your sofa now is not the best. You need to change it because this would be better. And if you tell somebody, maybe you should shorten that coat, or maybe you should reconsider about uh, what you're going to do. Anytime you do that. So I started journaling about every criticism is received, unsolicited advice is received as criticism. And I began paying attention in my own life, and it changed me. It changed the way I interacted with people at work. It changed drastically, the way I interacted with my daughter. Being aware of what you're doing um, helps you in every area of your life. All of your relationships, all of the tasks you have to do, you can avoid much of the friction that sometimes happens in those situations by just keeping your mouth shut. Um, and that has always been one of my struggles, is is not saying too much. Um, so the main thing I want you to remember is reflection moves us from experience to meaning. If you don't reflect, you won't discover all the meaning. Sometimes you have a blinding insight, but that's pretty rare. Mostly it's far more pedestrian than that. So keeping a journal helps you to pay attention to your life and helps you to realize what you already know, but just don't do. Writing about your life is a gift that you give to your family and your friends and to yourself. If they're one of the sections of the book, God Was With Me All Along, is about forgiveness. And all of us have things that we need to forgive and be forgiven for. And writing about our lives can give us the practice that we need so that we can do that in person, in real life. Writing about your life is a gift. It's a gift that you give yourself and your children and all the people you interact with, because if you pay attention, you will change. That's it. Thank you for today. Yeah, got it.
Friends, I think I am going to give us a connecting link, and I'm going to propose a future class where we will go deeper. The connecting link that I'd like to offer is this. The passage from Deuteronomy, the verse Mary Lou lifted up. Remember all the way the Lord our God has led you. The title for these 2 weeks that we have taken from our brief statement of faith: in life and in death, we belong to God. The subtitle of your book, or the title actually, God was with me all along. God is with us all along. Tiffany has invited us to faithfully live our lives in these earthly bodies, in our createdness which God has given us. To recognize that in our createdness, our mortal bodies too will pass. To live in that sacred, God-given reality with full awareness. And Mary Lou has invited us into the practice of telling the story of our lives, in which we will find God with us as we write, with us in our past, as we craft advanced directives and talk to our families. We will find the courage to live in our faith and to find the God who is with us as we live, who is with us as we prepare to die. Living as those prepared to die, dying as those prepared to go forth to live. We faithfully grieve, we celebrate life, and we witness to and claim the resurrection. I'll get to the first slide. Faithfully grieving, faithfully living and preparing, faithfully celebrating life, and pre-planning our own services of witness to the resurrection places us in life in a 360-degree faithful way. And even if part of us is resistant to doing these things, filling out advance directives, talking to our families, reflecting on palliative care, hospice care, writing and sharing our stories, when we face that resistance, our anxiety, our fear about our own deaths, we will receive the opportunity to grow in faith in a way which will strengthen us for the living of our days, for faithfully engaging grief and the glory of life and our own ultimate transition into the everlasting arms of God. We live a fully integrated life in all the dimensions of life. Who has remembered with children their first experience of the loss of a pet or a grandparent, right? Loss is woven into human life. It's part of our created existence by our Creator God. It's part of the way the world is put together. But as our brief statement of faith says, and we seek to truly live in life and in death, we belong to God. And preparing for our own end of life grounds us in that statement of faith. For all of life, which includes the celebration and the joy, it also includes the grief and the gratitude. As we mark the circling of our years, the ages and stages of our lives, our dying and our death, we live with mourning and with celebration. And we live grounded in our God, our eternal parent, Christ and Holy Spirit, creator, redeemer, and sustainer. I had a friend who had this up on her refrigerator. The holy mystery that created me will sustain me. My friend was living with and then dying with ovarian cancer. And I have never forgotten that phrase, for it provided light for her in the poignancy of the decline of her body. But as Tiffany said earlier, and as Mary Lou underscored, when we pause to reflect and find the meaning in our experience, which includes not only our living, but our dying, we find the power of the Spirit within us that is placed there by God, the light that shines even in the darkness. When we move through the green pastures and the still waters and into the valley of the shadow of death, where we are also accompanied by the Lord our God, and our spirit continues to shine. And so I close with someone who I'm sure Tiffany has studied, Ira Byock, who reminds us that as we live and as we die, and why we need to pre-plan our own services and write our own spiritual biographies and fill out our own advance directives, is because it puts us in touch with our God, with the sacred reality of our lives. And it puts us in touch with the things Ira Byock says we all need to be about. And we do it in different ways at the conclusion of our lives. We give forgiveness and we seek forgiveness. We say thank you. We say, I love you. And we say goodbye. And we do this in our own ways as we move into that holy mystery that sustains us beyond this life and into the next. So if there is any interest on a future Sunday, the rest of this presentation can be given to provide an opportunity for all of us to continue to theologically reflect. Because as we engage all of this, we will become people who live in the present with greater confidence as we face the future, as we wrestle with our past. We will become the people of God fully alive. So, thank you for sharing in these 2 weeks. Know that these resources remain available because they sit right next to my office, and they're part of this church's way that we seek to support one another in the journey of faith, of life, and of our own sacred reality of created beings in God who will ultimately face our own deaths. Know that your pastors, all of us, are available. And I was glad to hear, Kate, you said already, thanks for what I did put on your seats. This is a packet of materials for how we approach services of witness to the resurrection at Westminster. The template for our bulletin, some scripture passages front and back, and our guidelines, and a pre-planning sheet. Please know you can call upon any of us on your pastoral staff as we go forward and as you engage all these topics that are deep within our own hearts, souls, and minds, and bodies. Yes, because we live in bodies. We did not get to have the discussion we wanted to have, but I hope that if you want to say anything as we begin to close, anything? Was this helpful these 2 weeks? Was it? Any burning question? I know we wrapped up a lot in a short period of time. Well, please come to any of us with the questions that remain, and as we continue to live out our lives as God's children together. Blessings and peace. Take good care.